collapse of the Soviet Union can be traced back to the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. After the death of Stalin in 1953, conditions in Hungary worsened, with food and fuel shortages adding to the already mercurial atmosphere. People in Hungary demonstrated in the streets, calling for more freedoms, food, and the removal of Soviet oppression. Hungarian politician Imre Nagy was appointed the Prime Minister of the tumultuous nation, but after declaring that Hungary was leaving the Warsaw Pact, the USSR decided that he had gone too far, and Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and opened fire on the citizens. Cracks in the empire also showed when popular dissent with communism boiled over in 1968. In Czechoslovakia, leader Alexander Dubček allowed more freedoms for his people, creating a dramatic augmentation in ideas and criticisms of the USSR. This was known as the Prague Spring. Due to the defection of Dubček and his country, the Soviet army invaded Czechoslovakia. After Leonid Brezhnev signed off on the order to crush the Prague Spring and eliminate Imre Nagy, he spent another 14 years in office, ruling with the same ruthless efficiency as his predecessors, until his death in 1982. Brezhnev was succeeded by two more men with the same oppressive attitude, who both died less than 2 years after taking office: Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was chosen as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. The people found his youthful energy to be a pleasant change from the ill and aging politicians who had previously held office. More importantly, his openness and his belief in change proved to appeal far more to the people than the brutality of his predecessors.
When Mikhail Gorbachev came into power at the politically young age of 54, he used the terms perestroika, which means restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness, as the focus of his policies. These terms had been used before by Stalin and in Article 9 of the Soviet Constitution, but with different implications. Gorbachev first used these terms in a speech in December 1984. In addition to perestroika and glasnost, he also used a third term, uskorin, which means acceleration, but this term did not become popular because of its alternate definition of working harder. Perestroika was centered on decreasing the harsh command economy that was in effect through means of allowing semi-private small businesses and demonopolization. In addition, elections were introduced to increase the role of the people in the government. Glasnost allowed more freedoms, including the lessening of the censorship in media and allowing public criticisms of the USSR. These policies mildly resembled the principles of capitalism and democracy used in Western nations.
In November 1985, Gorbachev met with the American President Ronald Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland. At the meeting, both heads of state were seeking arms reduction and a step towards a more peaceful relationship. They spent 2 days discussing various topics, such as Soviet aggressions, American misinformation, and especially Reagan's research into developing SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile defense system. This meeting was inconclusive in regards to achieving any tangible results or agreements. Despite this lack of solid results, the Geneva Summit formed the foundations for many further meetings and negotiations between Reagan and Gorbachev. In a more humorous tone, Reagan was known for his pokes at the Soviet Union. The following joke by Reagan highlights the lack of freedoms in the USSR.
And one of these stories, the one I'm going to tell you, I told to General Secretary Gorbachev, and he laughed. The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries, and the American said, look, in my country I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, you can? He says, yes. I can go into the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country.
After several more conferences, the two leaders began to form a familiarity. They managed to accomplish several goals and agreements. For example, they met on October 11, 1986 in Iceland, and surprisingly agreed to limit the number of medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe. and more importantly, they agreed in principle to eradicate all nuclear weapons within the next 10 years. As a result of this conference, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed in 1987. Gorbachev sought arms reduction because he had realized that he needed to postpone the arms race so he could improve the standard of living and ultimately the value of life for individuals in the USSR, which had been his foremost goal all along. Previously, building nuclear weapons was the primary focus of the Soviet budget and industry, leaving most consumer needs unresolved.
Welcome to the White House. This ceremony and the treaty we're signing today are both excellent examples of the rewards of patience. Unlike treaties in the past, it didn't simply codify the status quo or a new arms buildup. It didn't simply talk of controlling an arms race. For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction. In this case, the complete elimination of an entire class of US and Soviet nuclear missiles.
Perestroika and glasnost also caused turmoil because when the USSR granted more freedoms to its republics, regions began to demand self-determination. Nationalist groups in the Soviet republics of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldavia demanded self-rule. Also, the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were extremely active in demanding their independence because they were annexed into the USSR against their will in the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. These uprisings caused Gorbachev to attack the Lithuanian people in January 1991 and kill 14 civilians. This greatly angered the people of the Soviet Union and caused Gorbachev to quickly lose his popular support.
The democratically elected president of Russia was soon striding out of the building to address a crowd of supporters. His own radio and television stations by now occupied and forced off the air, he climbed aboard one of the Red Army's own tanks and said the coup leaders had disgraced the Soviet Union.
Они дискредитируют Союз перед всем миром, подрывая наш престиж в мировом сообществе, возвращает нас к эпохе холодной войны и изоляции Советского Союза от мирового сообщества. Все это заставляет нас объявить незаконным пришедший к власти.
The events shown in the newscast took place on August 18, 1991, during the coup to depose Gorbachev from office. During this time, he was vacationing in Moscow. All of his 5 phone lines were cut, and he was told by the State Emergency Committee that they had taken charge and that Vice President Gennady Yanayev was going to be the new acting president. When Parliament member and former mayor of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, came to know of the uprising, he went to the Russian White House infuriated at what his fellow comrades were doing. There, he defiantly marched through the military blockade, stood on a tank, and declared that the Russian people involved in the coup have betrayed the Soviet Union and will be tried for treason, and that he was acquiring control over all Russian territory. He was able to become the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic on June 12, 1991, through a democratic election because he had won the popular support during his tank speech. This time marked the dissolve of the stronghold that the Communist Party had maintained over the Soviet Union. After this coup, Gorbachev resigned as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and the Soviet Parliament stopped all party activities in the government. The turmoil caused by glasnost and perestroika, combined with this coup, ultimately caused the collapse of the USSR. Before collapsing entirely, the republics became the Commonwealth of Independent States, also known as the CIS. Georgia and the Baltic nations, however, refused to join the CIS. On Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation as president, and this marked the death of the Soviet Union. After the death of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin maintained his role of president of Russia and implemented his plans and ideas. One plan he used was known as shock therapy, and it involved drastically changing the communist markets to free markets through the lowering of trade barriers, the removing of price controls, and the ending of subsidies to state-owned industries. This caused a drastic inflation rate of 800%, and many people lost their jobs. In addition to shock therapy, Yeltsin is also famous for his relations with Chechnya, a mainly Muslim area in southwestern Russia that declared independence. Yeltsin denied this independence statement, and in 1994 he sent 40,000 Russian troops into the capital city of Grozny and destroyed it. This obliteration angered the Russians and caused Yeltsin to resign and appoint Vladimir Putin as acting president.
Vladimir Putin, former KGB officer and deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, joined the national government when he was appointed as the head of the FSB, the replacement agency to the KGB. In 1999, he became the head of the nation's Security Council, then as Prime Minister. Putin earned national fame after becoming involved with the conflict in Chechnya. After the failed altercation from 1994 to 1996, the new leader began a second war in the obstinate region, one that was still itching for independence despite their near destruction. He was praised for his actions because he dealt with the region with force, and his tactics were more organized, while Yeltsin's efforts were erratic. After Yeltsin resigned in late 1999, Putin was democratically elected as president, riding on the popularity he gained from the Chechnya conflict. Putin brought widespread changes to the Russian government and economy, but he assured the people that his core ideologies would stay traditionalistic. Like his communist predecessors, he said that he would keep Russia's government strong, unlike the weaker democratic regimes of Western nations. Even though Putin was democratically elected, the government he led did not become fully democratic. In fact, the leader consolidated power to himself, like a monarchy or dictatorship. For example, the communist policy of censorship was continued. Putin and his administration took over all independent media outlets in Russia and shut down organizations that spoke against him. Due to Putin's media monopoly, he had no trouble being re-elected in 2004, and his supporters maintained the majority in Russia's legislative body, the Duma. To give himself even more power, Putin passed legislation dictating that the regional governors would not be democratically elected anymore. They would be personally appointed by the president. In addition, the president forced laws through the Duma in 2005, making it even harder for small, independent parties to get into the legislature, giving Putin and his party even more freedoms and power. However, all of what Putin did was not for himself. He led many reforms that dramatically loosened Russia's economy, allowing for more financial freedom for the country. To improve the economy of the nation, the president encouraged investment by foreign companies and lowered taxes, which thrust Russia onto the world stage and improved trade relations with other nations. These beneficial reforms did come with some drawbacks. In a move that was a step back from the freeing of the Russian economy, Putin and his administration forcefully took control of all independent oil companies in the nation, and the government capitalized on the country's largest industry unfairly. In addition, oil and natural gas was cited as the main powerhouse of Russian economic growth, and the government was restricting it. Despite real improvements in the financial well-being of the country, the economy and people of Russia were still unbalanced. The majority of people were neither wealthy nor poor. They were caught on the bubble between poverty and the middle class, still struggling to get by. During the 1980s, the policy of détente collapsed between the US and the Soviet Union, and both nations remained confrontational for the next decade. In regards to foreign policy, Putin wanted to reinstitute Russia as a world power. Putin did not back down from this aggressive stance, but he did attempt to improve US relations. In another move to help the US, Putin sent troops to eradicate the Taliban in Afghanistan after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Putin ensured that Dmitry Medvedev was elected as Russia's next president in 2008. However, Putin became president once again in 2012, despite the nation's constitution banning a president from serving a third term.
Vladimir Putin has returned to office in very regal style to serve a controversial third term as Russian president. He was sworn in at the Kremlin for another 6 years with the option to run again in 2018.
Putin has played a large role in Russia's current world affairs. After restarting the Chechen conflict, the war dragged on for 9 years, with Russian troops leaving the region in 2009, but the conflict remains unresolved to this day. Russia has done some things that are reminiscent of its policies during the Cold War. It has armed terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah in nations like Syria and Iran, drawing ire from the West. Its most controversial act was aiding Iran with the construction of nuclear weapons, giving $1 billion to arms development, blatantly undoing the United Nations sanctions against the Middle Eastern nation to deter it from creating weapons of mass destruction. Russia still has a large role in world affairs, and traces of the Cold War can still be found. For example, possible terrorism in regards to Chechnya was thrust back into the spotlight with the April 15th Boston Marathon bombings. In addition, with circumstances that sound like it came straight from the Cold War, an employee at the US Embassy in Moscow was caught trying to recruit a Russian to join the CIA, and was accused of spying on Russia on May 15th. The impact and consequences of the Soviet Union and its demise are not far away.